And our attention to the story of a Russian businesswoman whose treatment in Kuwait has led to calls for sanctions to be imposed on the state's government. Marsha Lazareva had worked for a decade in the oil-rich Gulf state when she was accused of embezzlement, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison with hard labour. Well, she has maintained her innocence throughout, and there's been a high-profile international campaign to free her, which resulted in her release from jail on bail after more than a year, but she's still not allowed to leave Kuwait with her 5-year-old son. Now, her supporters include Neil Bush, the son of former President George W. Bush, of course, and 5 members of the US Congress have called for sanctions to be imposed. Also on her side is the human rights lawyer Cherie Blair, who founded the Cherie Blair Foundation for Women, and I'm delighted to say that she joins me now. Thank you very much for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
This evening. It's a very concerning case, this, isn't it? Marsha spent 470 days in a cell, locked up with other women, sentenced to hard labour. Just give us an idea of exactly what she was accused of doing.
Well, let me say, first of all, that this is not just about Marsha. This is actually about worrying signs that the rule of law is being heavily undermined in Kuwait. And particularly that makes foreign workers, whether you're a high-flying executive, which Marsha was, or a migrant domestic worker, you're very, very vulnerable, because however high and comfortably off you may be, once you are in the control of the state and particularly imprisoned, then obviously you are particularly vulnerable. And I think this is a particular issue for women as well, because of the attitude towards women, sadly, is not good in many of these countries.
And there are big questions about the legal system and how Marsha is being treated, because she was essentially convicted largely as a result of false documentation, forged documents.
Everybody who has, anyone who's independent, who has looked at the case against Marsha, and there are 2 cases against Marsha, but anyone who's looked at the evidence is just astonished that any prosecutor could have thought that this was a case. In the case that she was convicted, for example, where she was accused of falsely claiming money from the Kuwaiti Port Authority for services rendered. The truth was the documents that were used to convict her were forged, and indeed the person who forged them was subsequently charged with and convicted himself of forgery and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for that. He actually absconded, not to do his sentence. So the other extraordinary thing about that case was the civil courts in Kuwait, a separate system from the criminal courts, actually also considered that case and, in fact, ordered the Kuwaiti Port Authority to pay the money, which they said was due. So you have, on the one hand, the civil court saying this money is due, and on the other hand, a prosecutor pursuing a case against all reason, even when there was evidence that this was not a case at all, and when the defence was not allowed to put evidence.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And it does beg the question, you know, if she is so obviously innocent, who's manipulating the system? Who's behind this? Well,
unfortunately, and I think this is an issue for anyone who's wanting to work in a foreign country and anyone who's thinking of making an investment in Kuwait, because at the heart of this, actually, is a commercial rivalry between 2 firms, one of which is the parent company of the fund that Marsha worked for, and the other is a rival company who are competing with each other for American defence contracts, hence the interest of the Americans in this particular case. And one of those, the business rival, is very well connected politically and has been able to manipulate the legal system to try and damage their business rivals.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the United States. We know that Neil Bush is heavily involved in the campaign, and we and the West have always been good friends with Kuwait. How have international relations been damaged by this, and how could they be damaged in the future?
Well, it's very unfortunate. You may know that the Emir of Kuwait has been ill, and sadly, I don't think he's really very aware of what's been going on here. But despite the efforts, the extraordinary thing is, it's not just the Americans, it's not just, even if you like, the British, because my law firm, Omnia Strategy, are representing her along with British barristers. It's also the Russians too who are involved, and it's been raised by the Russian foreign minister about the treatment of their citizen. And yet, despite this, there is this blockage which lies firmly, I think, with the Attorney General and the prosecutors, and sadly too some of the judges in the case. And that's why we have filed proceedings in the United Nations, in Geneva with the Human Rights Commission, complaining of her treatment, complaining about her arbitrary detention, and also complaining to the Special Rapporteur about the independence of the judges. And he has actually tweeted just recently his concern about what has happened in this case. Because if the rule of law is manipulated in this way, then actually no one is safe.
Yeah, how would you sum up the human rights of Kuwait at the moment?
Well, as I said, I think at the moment foreign workers in Kuwait are vulnerable because it's not just Marsha. While she was in prison, she came across a number of women unjustly accused. Many of them were migrant workers, and only yesterday a report came out, again with the UN Rapporteur on Human Trafficking, highlighting what is essentially a slave bazaar that is being carried on among domestic workers in Kuwait, using Apple apps, using Facebook, and girls as young as 16 being promoted for sale, essentially, as chattels that can be used with advice saying, you know, don't give them their passports, you know, don't give them any holidays. Yeah. You can imagine how vulnerable these women are, the domestic workers, or are far away from home. And when Marsha was in prison, she befriended a lot of them and tried to help them with their case. But frankly, when the legal system is stacked against you, even someone as Marsha, who's so well connected now and has so many people on her side, no one seems to be listening. Yeah, fortunately, the international community is now listening and are raising questions about what exactly is going on in Kuwait.
Good. Excellent. We're running short of time, but it won't have escaped your notice that we do have a general election on the way. And I was just interested in getting your thoughts about what it's like to be in the spotlight when a campaign gets underway.
Well, I myself have been campaigning in general elections since I was 16, which sadly is quite a long time ago now. And elections are so... They're an amazing thing because you could never know what's going to happen. And I think this election particularly, no one really knows what's going to happen because it all comes down to an individual and their votes. And I know lots of people say, oh, you know, what does it matter? My vote's not going to count. But actually, every vote does count. And I think particularly now, when everything is so uncertain, that people casting their votes really can make a difference. So I don't envy those who are out canvassing and traipsing the streets in December.
It's not much fun.
It's not the best of fun. I remember the 97 election.
Yeah, we just see some footage of you in 97.
The sun always seemed to be shining and there was a sense of excitement and that, you know, a good change was coming. I fear that that's not going to be quite the feeling in the dark days of December.
You've talked about the campaigning work you do for women, and I'm interested in knowing what the atmosphere is like now compared to when you were in Downing Street, because it does seem to have become very toxic, doesn't it? It's become very poisonous, and a lot of it is directed at women and women politicians.
I think it's really shocking that so many good women MPs of all parties have felt the pressure on them and their families has led to many of them standing down. And maybe it's a bit tied in with, again, the internet and what is happening and how that, rather than bringing people together, seems to be polarising people. So whether you have the internet being used to sell domestic workers in Kuwait or the internet being used to make, you know, horrendous threats of violence and rape and just unpleasantness to women MPs, it does appear as though people think they can do and say things on the internet with impunity and which they would never dream of doing face-to-face.
Yeah, it's a very different time. Cherie Blair, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for coming and speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. Thank you.